Preparations are in full swing for a summit between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden this month, but analysts say they do not expect any breakthroughs given the long-standing issues looming over the talks. They say the much-anticipated meeting could, however, bode well for U.S.-China ties and send a positive signal to regional countries that the world's two biggest economies are managing their differences and trying to ease tensions. The White House confirmed that the two leaders will meet in San Francisco later this month, with spokeswoman Karine Jean-Pierre saying Biden will have a tough but important conversation with the Chinese leader. The U.S. confirmation came after talks between top Chinese diplomat Wang Yi and key officials in Washington, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. They had agreed to make joint efforts to clinch a meeting between the two heads of state. The U.S. will host the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco from November 11th, and the American and Chinese presidents are expected to meet on the sidelines of the gathering. The Chinese foreign minister also met with Biden during his recent three-day visit to Washington. But according to a statement from China's foreign ministry, Wang cautioned that the road to the San Francisco summit will not be a smooth one, and that the two countries cannot rely on autopilot for it to happen. Diplomatic observers are largely keeping expectations low in terms of what the leaders' first in-person talks in a year can actually achieve. "I do not expect a major breakthrough. I do not expect a major thaw," said Chong Jia-Ian, a political scientist at the National University of Singapore. He said he expected both sides to try to get a better understanding of each other's position while signaling a desire for further dialogue. "There may be some establishment of more stable mutual expectations, perhaps more dialogue to deconflict and mitigate risk," Chung said, adding that there was likely to be some emphasis on mutual respect and reciprocity. Relations between the two world powers deteriorated rapidly last year, but both sides have worked to improve communication and increase engagements in recent months, with top U.S. officials making trips to China. Last week, an economic working group of officials from both countries held their first meeting in a further effort to manage tensions. David Arraes, resident professor of international politics with the Hopkins Nanjing Center for Chinese and American Studies, said a wide range of issues could be on the table when the leaders meet. Among other things, he expected that they would call for the release of hostages and for humanitarian relief for Gaza citizens, agree to make efforts to reduce tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, and they were also likely to promote cooperation in non-strategic areas such as climate change. Wang raised these themes with U.S. officials as they exchanged views on the ongoing conflict in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine. For the Xi-Biden meeting, Arraes expected Washington to seek Beijing's help to pressure Russia, North Korea, and Iran, countries that are challenging American interests. Beijing, meanwhile, could be expected to ask for a rollback of economic sanctions imposed on China by the U.S. But their efforts, according to Arraes, were likely to be met with little success. He said a Xi-Biden meeting may not achieve any major outcomes, but it could reopen lines of regular discussion and consultation that arrest the worrisome decline and growing hostility in bilateral ties. Alfred Wu, associate professor at the National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, said the topics Xi and Biden would discuss were contingent on the time allocated for the summit. If the leaders have more time, Wu expected a more elaborate discussion on issues plaguing bilateral ties. If not, they could be expected to chart a general direction to manage relations, open lines of communication, and to not make the situation worse, he said. When Xi and Biden last met on the sidelines of the Group of 20 summit in Indonesia last November, they spoke for 3 hours on topics ranging from Taiwan to North Korea. Wu said flashpoints including the South China Sea and Taiwan could be touched on, but neither side would have any expectation that these long-standing issues would be resolved. Particularly, for the South China Sea, China's position is very different from the U.S. and that of other claimant states like the Philippines, he said, calling it a deadlock issue. China claims almost the entire resource-rich waterway, and its Coast Guard has in recent months been involved in several standoffs with vessels from neighboring countries such as the Philippines. Washington has backed Manila and reiterated its commitment to protect the Philippines in the event of an armed attack in the South China Sea. Wu suggested that the two leaders would view the summit as a channel to speak to each other while trying to avoid the worst-case scenario, which is war. The meeting would help both leaders domestically too, he said. For Biden, the summit would signal that he was capable of communicating with China. And for Xi, it would present China as being treated as equals with the US and a leader of the world. While the summit could be beneficial for both sides, Wu noted that the two countries had very different values, such as their views on the Ukraine war and their visions for the global order, which could limit the success of the talks. With the U.S. election nearing and Republicans ready to seize on any sign of weakness, the Biden administration may have little room for flexibility even when it comes to shared global problems such as the Israel-Gaza conflict, according to Chong from the NUS. Wang Huiyao, founder of Beijing-based think tank the Center for China and Globalization, said a Xi-Biden summit would be very significant, especially to China's neighbors. Leaders in the region have long called for more stable U.S.-China ties and have voiced growing concerns about having to take sides in the heightened superpower rivalry. A mere picture of the two leaders shaking hands will send a huge signal to the outside world, Wang said, calling the summit long overdue. Wang said he expected the meeting to work towards stopping the downward spiral of bilateral ties and improve people-to-people exchanges between the two nations. The meeting will produce a good result for other regions. It's meeting the expectations of the world, he said. The world needs stability, and when the leaders of the two largest economies meet, it will stabilize the world economy and generate good signals for the rest of the world. Arrays from the Hopkins Nanjing Center for Chinese and American Studies said a Xi-Biden meeting would convey a message to the world that the U.S. and China were acting responsibly to peacefully manage their differences. Southeast Asian countries, which have increasingly found themselves sandwiched between the U.S. and China, would find that reassuring, but they would remain on guard, he said. They know that Sino-U.S. relations remain fraught, and that growing instability in Europe, the Middle East, and Northeast Asia create ripple effects that have a destabilizing effect in Southeast Asia, he said. Chong said regional countries would view the meeting as a desire for stability on Beijing and Washington's part. But he said while some were hoping for a return to the engagement of the 1990s and 2000s, it would not be possible. Neither the U.S. nor China have an interest to return to that situation, even if they wish to prevent their competition from spiraling out of control, he said. Southeast Asia will have to learn to live with a more contentious world where there is more major power friction. The U.S. believes that the two sides will be able to make some modest announcements following their meeting, but the fundamental differences in the relationship will remain unchanged, according to the person, who was not authorized to comment publicly and spoke on the condition of anonymity. Jude Blanchett, chair of China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, said Biden and Xi were looking to intentionally keep that bar low. What's going on here is an attempt to have a deep conversation where the two sides directly share their concerns, but more importantly that the meeting unlocks, especially in the Chinese system, space for further engagement and constructive work, Blanchett said. There's been plenty of effort by both sides to lay the groundwork for the expected San Francisco meeting.